Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Wow, this is exciting. All of a sudden, everybody turned up. 15 minutes ago was a completely empty room, so thank you. It will be worth your time because this is going to be a fantastic panel. We're very excited. Obviously, there is nothing that could be more timely at the moment than this topic in the art market. I'll do a little housekeeping first. My name is Linda Lees. I'm the Director of Cultural Programming and Special Projects for TEFAF New York. And I welcome all of you to this and others. There should be a cultural brochure in your chair, so please have a look and join us for other things. We also have a panel on the Latin American art market, so we're full of art news, this cultural program, as is appropriate for an art fair. So thank you again for being here. I'm not going to waste your time babbling, except to say, please check your cell phones again, even though you think you've turned them off. Are you really sure? Do you want to take another look? Just in case. And then I'll throw it over to Natasha Deegan. I'm terrifically happy to have Natasha back. This is the second moderating gig for her with us, so I know what an expert she is. She's professor and chair of art market studies at the Fashion Institute of Technology. Natasha.
Thank you so much, Linda, and thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to moderate this panel on such a timely topic, Chinese art and its markets. And indeed, China has come a long way in recent years. It was illegal to own, inherit, or exchange works of art in China until 1976, after Mao Zedong died, and no art market infrastructure existed in mainland China until the 1990s. However, since the mid-2000s, China's ascent has been rapid. While China represented less than 1% of global market share in 2000, it grew to constitute an estimated 30% of the art market in 2011, when China reportedly overtook the United States to become the largest art market in the world. According to a 2015 Citibank report, China accounted for 1/3 of growth in the global art market from 2000 to 2014. At the same time, art museums in China, both public and private, proliferated. With China's rise, Hong Kong has consolidated its position as the hub of the Asian art market and an art capital on par with New York and London, buttressed by its free port status, advantageous geographical location, ease of doing business, and visa-free entry from nationals from over 170 countries. In 2013, Art Basel bought a majority stake in Art Hong Kong in order to gain a foothold in this market. Since then, it has become requisite for global art businesses to maintain a presence in Hong Kong. But recent protests in Hong Kong have brought simmering political issues to a boil and to international attention. US-China trade tensions persist with no signs of conciliation, as the United States imposed a new 15% tax on artworks originated from China on September 1st. Economic growth in China has fallen to its lowest level since 1992. So there is certainly a lot for us to discuss in the limited time that we have today. But first, I just want to briefly introduce our panelists. On the far end, we have Gadi Epstein, The Economist China Affairs editor. Previously, he served as media editor, writing extensively about how technology is changing TV, film, music, and other media. Before that, he served as Beijing bureau chief and China correspondent, writing about Chinese politics and society. Prior to joining The Economist in 2011, Gadi was Beijing bureau chief for Forbes for 4 years, and before that was Beijing bureau chief and international projects reporter for the Baltimore Sun. And next to Gadi, we have Kejia Wu, a member of the faculty at Sotheby's Institute of Art in New York and adjunct faculty at Claremont Graduate University in Los Angeles. She is a columnist for the Financial Times Chinese, the author of TEFAF's Art Market Report 2019, the Chinese art market, very relevant to our conversation today, and co-author of the Global Art Importation and Exportation Tax Report commissioned by the China Association of Auctioneers and the Chinese Ministry of Culture. Before joining Sotheby's Institute, she oversaw Asia projects and strategies at Sotheby's in the office of the CEO while based in New York. And then finally, next to me here, we have Boon Tan, Vice President for Global Arts and Cultural Programs and Director of Asia Society Museum. In this role, he leads Asia Society's global arts and cultural activities, oversees its acclaimed collections, and directs its Asia Arts and Museum Network and Arts and Museum Summit. Prior to this, he was Assistant Chief Executive for Museums and Programs under Singapore's National Heritage Board. He has also served as director of the Singapore Art Museum, where beginning in 2009, he led the curatorial team in building the largest public collection of contemporary art in Southeast Asia. He also curated major events, including the Night Festival and Children's Season, directed the 2011 Singapore Biennale, and both directed and co-curated the 2013 Biennale, which drew some 500,000 visitors. So on that note, I want to just thank all of our panelists for joining us today. And maybe just start the conversation by discussing Hong Kong. What is the current situation and how did we get here? Adi, illuminate this for us.
I can do that in 2 seconds. I'll start with how we got here. Hong Kong in the spring, which of course Hong Kong has its own, under one country, two systems, is supposed to have its own system of justice, its own political system that's separate and distinct from the mainland. And in the spring, there was this extradition bill that was going through the legislative process in Hong Kong that would have subjected Hong Kong citizens to the possibility that they be extradited to mainland China for trial if they had been arrested for a crime. And there was a lot of opposition to this. There was already a feeling amongst many in Hong Kong that their freedoms under one country, two systems were gradually eroding. And this extradition bill became sort of the flashpoint. And even though the target initially wasn't the idea of extraditing people in Hong Kong to China, it was about a murder that had happened in Taiwan. This became, the kind of spark for the protests of the last 5 months. The extradition bill was shelved at some point early on, but not withdrawn, and the protests just grew in intensity. The police response to the protests became, for what was Hong Kong, uncharacteristically aggressive. Previous protests have been much more handled much more patiently, and that has just kind of entered Hong Kong into sort of a spiral of ever more kind of violent and aggressive protests and reactions to the protests. This week has been a pretty newsy week in Hong Kong or related to Hong Kong. In China, there was a plenum at which the top leadership met for 4 days and discussed, all sorts of issues facing the future of the Communist Party. But one of the biggest findings to come out of that was that they should take some steps to, quote unquote, safeguard the national security of Hong Kong. And it is expected that there'll be another shoe to drop from that. We don't know what that really means yet, but we can expect perhaps another shift in strategy from Beijing towards Hong Kong. So that's on one front. On another, Joshua Wong, who was a key figure in the Occupy protest, the umbrella movement of 2014-15, was barred from running for office in Hong Kong. That was a few days ago. The economy is doing terribly in Hong Kong. Those numbers just came out. They just had their worst quarter since the global financial crisis. The economy shrunk 3.2%. And that's something, of course, that'll directly touch on what we're talking about today. And of course, we just had Halloween, and to celebrate, protesters were out wearing Xi Jinping masks and Carrie Lam masks in defiance of this mask ban that they have in Hong Kong that's been introduced for the protests. So there has been no sign of any way out. It's unclear what steps can be taken from here. The protesters have demands that include Carrie Lam stepping down, an independent inquiry into the police behavior in response to the protests, and so forth. It's unclear whether Beijing is at all inclined to cave into those demands at some point. And there's rumors that Carrie Lam may step down, maybe early next year. I was just remarking to friends here on the panel that I suspect that they won't do that until they have both a strategy for what to do with when the successor is in place, and that maybe the plenum this week dealt with that to some degree, and then also like they have to find who wants to take that job, which must be, you know, not the best job in the world right now. So that's about sums it up.
Well, thank you for that very concise sort of introduction. But even though we will return to the future outlook, I first want to talk a little bit about the sort of how we got here. And it does seem like this has been an evolving situation for some time. Boon, I know that you have mentioned that if you've been observing culture in Hong Kong, that there was sort of signs maybe of this kind of tension and unrest for some time now. I don't know if you could talk to that.
Oh, I think, I mean, I'm not a policy expert, but if you've been following, and the difficulty with Hong Kong is that really at the international level, you know, there are very few Hong Kong artists that are widely sort of circulated. Even though we're saying Chinese artists, there are not very few of them are from Hong Kong, and that's another PhD going on there. But I think, you know, a few years ago, just 2 years ago, the Asia Society, the Hong Kong Center, did a show, and the brief was to look at the younger generation, people under 35, artists, and the show was called Breathing Space. But when you go to the show, and most of these artists are not known outside the city, outside Hong Kong itself. But when you saw the show, and the title says it, of Breathing Space, there is this kind of sense among the work of the younger artists, those under 40, under 35, of a kind of pressure on identity, a kind of squeezing, you know, that is not about employment, it's not about what all the politicians say, but it's a kind of much more, I don't want to, it's cultural, but it's also a kind of stress about identity, about their place in the world, and all these questioning about what are we now, you know, how do we sort of move forward, and this idea of breathing space that many of them, the work, seem to be suggesting that there is a kind of increasingly breathing is slightly difficult or challenging. So that's very interesting, and we do know from studying the history of art that artists actually are very advanced barometers of these kind of, again, it's not about unemployment, it's not about trade, it's not, but very generally about at the civilizational level. If one follows, particularly outside Europe and America, the work of artists, and if you track generation by generation, you can see these kinds of shifts and responses to very deep sort of, not pressures, but very deep sort of concerns, even at a very existential level. So I think that is sort of, you know, apparent. And of course, one should realize that the most recent developments, at least if you look at the art, really has a much longer sort of runway. I mean, really the last major shift in terms of the Chinese art world, so I'm including, you know, Asian art world, was the 2008 financial crisis. I mean, that sort of rewrote certain things, and it's not just Hong Kong, Chinese art scene was completely sort of affected. So I think what we're seeing is the latest round, except now the manifestation is coming out from one particular place that didn't erupt into popular consciousness, you know, in the 2008 kind of change, you know.
Mm-hmm. So I also want to, we've been talking about this situation that perhaps has been a long time in the making, but I also do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the future outlook. So what can we expect from Hong Kong, both in terms of its status as an art capital, but also as a financial hub in Asia? Kuja, do you want to talk a little bit about perhaps Hong Kong's particular role in the market?
So I just want to, I know Gadi and Boon has gave a pretty clear overview of the political and art creation contest. And I just want to draw us back a little bit on the art market. So based on a lot of latest research number disclosed, there is a major structural change if we look at Asia as a region in terms of the art trade. The totality number, Beijing is still higher than Hong Kong. We're talking about public art transaction in terms of the number we collected through public auctions. So, for example, in the past couple of years, the total annual turnover in terms of public auction in Beijing versus Hong Kong, Beijing is about over twice the total number. So if you look at Asia purely from a transactional perspective of art, Beijing is the bigger center. However, I mean, there's a lot of complexity in terms of trading art in mainland China. We don't have time to go to the nitty-gritty, but overall, the biggest elephant in the room is the tax load. So for anyone to bring artworks, no matter it's Chinese art or Western art, into mainland China, with the tax load, you have to pay over 20%, which is make it very difficult. As a result, although the total transaction number in Hong Kong in terms of a public auction is lower than Beijing, it has a tremendous advantage because it's a free port. So I think nobody can give an accurate prediction of what's going to happen on the political side, but I think because of the tax load, bring artworks into China, Hong Kong will stay, I think, in the near future, have this advantage position to answer your question.
Yeah, and I think, building on that, I do think Hong Kong has a very unique position, but it's clearly at risk regionally, right? You could imagine another Asian hub for the art market, and perhaps another jurisdiction that would exploit this opportunity, right? If you have tear gas in the lobby of wafting in the lobby of the Peninsula Hotel, while you're holding Art Basel, which that confluence hasn't happened yet, but you can imagine it.
Hypothetical.
I mean, the tear gas in the peninsula is not a hypothetical, right? It did happen.
And Art Basel is coming up, and Art Basel
is
they will
coming
be
up.
holding the fair.
And it's a rather kind of, it's almost like you'd imagine it in a Wes Anderson movie to see that kind of mix of kind of strange politics and people focused on buying expensive pieces of art, or exhibiting them, or auctioning them. And I think that is something that Hong Kong will have to worry about for years to come, regardless of how this particular episode, how this particular wave of protests ends. And what I think one thing I may have wanted to add to my earlier kind of summation is, what I think this reaction from the Chinese government to the protests in these last few months was somewhat surprising to me in the short term, but I think inevitable in the long term that you'd have this kind of conflict. And what I mean by that is there's the younger generation growing up in Hong Kong, as Boon was kind of mentioning. They have grown up. They can see the expiration date on one country, two systems, which is within their lifetimes, and in fact within their working lives. 2047, right? If I'm getting my math right. And that doesn't seem that very far away to them. And that only gets closer and closer with time. And so that feeling of desperation and that desire for breathing space will only grow. The reason I thought that the reaction from Beijing was a bit surprising is, in terms of or the Hong Kong authorities, backed by Beijing, is that I didn't think time is on their side, and I didn't think they needed to be so aggressive. And they could have probably done something similar as they did to the umbrella movement in 2014-15, which is sort of wait it out, or be a little bit more conciliatory in the short term, because they hold all the cards. And so I think the fact that that didn't happen, and it's already getting to this point of conflict, is very worrying for the next few years ahead. And I do think that you could see a shift in the art market in Asia because of it.
And I think going back to your earlier point, I think we also, in terms of art and the role of the importance or the rankings of city in art, and I need to be very precise what I'm going to say next, is I think particularly Hong Kong makes clear one sort of aspect, is when we, and the press sometimes confuses it, and art market people, I feel, sort of the rhetoric overwhelms it. When we speak of it as an art capital, we need to disaggregate it, and you are perfectly right, I think, in saying that Hong Kong is special. Because when we talk about Hong Kong as an art capital, it's almost exclusively as a mercantilist center, as a center for transaction. That's what a hub is. If you're a hub, you don't add anything, you don't produce anything, you facilitate the exchange and transaction. And the reality is that cities that are just purely hubs, that means you are facilitating this transaction, which may be trillions of dollars theoretically, or whatever, how many amounts, but it's not sticky to that place. And hence, going back to your point, the question is, if Hong Kong remains basically what it is now, it's a trading hub for the selling and the exchange of art. What happens when southern China, develops to the point and all it takes is certain sort of minor legal transactions, what it becomes a different kind of free trade zone. For instance, and we know China has done this. That's how the opening began with the southern kind of provinces. But what if that is done just for art? I think that is a problem. And the other challenge is that, again, going back to this longer durational change from when the market restructuring happened in 2008, what you also see, and now in China, you see a lot of interesting things that are happening also in the South. And in the South, you also begin to see a group of younger artists who are oddly enough very trained in classical art, in, for example, ink. They're literally trained, they can write like really proficient, but they also are very adept at using new media and digital art. There's something going on there. It's not very clear, and especially if you read Western sources, completely cannot get it, because the two seem so diametrical. But in the South, you begin to get, artists like Lu Yang, you have many of these people that are synthesizing, and you see there's something there. And if you could imagine if one day there is a kind of alignment with this new resurgence in a particular kind of art production, and what if the sort of economic environment shifts, and you could theoretically see, there is another Hong Kong somewhere there, but it's easily within the larger sort of national kind of framework, And repeatedly, I've always said that I think that in terms of art, there is a kind of challenge with Hong Kong in that I think artistic production, indigenous artistic production, needs to come out of the country. It needs to enter that global kind of discourse. Otherwise, it will, as time goes on, it gets more and more sort of marginalized. So, we had that discussion when somebody mentioned, will the M+ change that? And I said, yeah, maybe, but it depends on what kind of institution it aspires to. Is it aspiring to a Euro-American kind of framework? Is it trying to be the MoMA of Hong Kong? Is it trying to be the Tate of Hong Kong, of that part, southern China? Or is there something more that could also catalyze, indigenous production to tie, in a sense, to add into this commercial sort of framework, And so for me, personally, and again, I'm not an economic specialist, not a policy specialist, but I'm more interested in what the new Hong Kong Museum of Art is doing with its ink, because it is there that you see the fusion in this one artistic form of artists from China, from Taiwan, from Southeast Asia, using this tradition with Hong Kong artists. And it's something that is very interesting going on. It's because there's so little literature in English that looks at this. But to me, that is one of the most interesting things that are happening. And I would say the plus side is, for all the criticism, I think there is something in that West Kowloon development that is filling in a missing piece of the art ecology of Hong Kong. For it, I mean, personally, I do believe it cannot just remain a mercantilist hub, because a mercantilist hub can always change. Art Basel can move very easily. As we've seen when they've suddenly overnight sold, their shares in India, they've declined to participate in the new fair. And again, one last point is, I think the competition in the area is quite interesting in that sense, because with Hong Kong, and I full disclosure, I'm from Singapore, but that's another thing. And Singapore, there's a reason why the South China Morning Post is so obsessed with comparing the Hong Kong art scene and everything in Hong Kong to Singapore. There is a kind of obsession with it. I mean, you just Google. It's endlessly comparing everything from, whatever to whatever. But I think at heart, there is a kind of difference between the comparison. The pressure is there because here you have a mercantilist city, and there you have a mercantilist city, but a city that is in the midst and is drawing in artistic production from a large emerging region, not an established scene like the Chinese scene, but an emerging region. So that they are also different kind of comparisons, but I think Hong Kong is very unique in its circumstance.
You mentioned M+, which has not fully opened yet, but I know that Shanghai is another city that has experienced museum building on a very impressive scale in recent years, with more private museums, at least, than any other city in the region. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the developments in Shanghai and in mainland China in terms of the museum infrastructure.
So just to touch base on what Ben Hui said, I absolutely agree with you. I think a lot of Chinese artists, including in Hong Kong, are marginalized. Like, if any artist from that part of the world announce herself, the political label is always associated with that person. So people sometimes ignore their identity. Like, I think Lu Yang is one of the rarity that she managed to escape from the China branding and in terms of what she does. So there are a couple of trends that are happening, like both, as Gadi mentioned, the transactional number is definitely down in addition to the grand political scale. So in terms of Hong Kong, when you look at the Sotheby's Hong Kong, the total sales, which just finished in the past October, was about 8% down year on year, 11% down season on season. And when you look at mainland China, the whole picture in terms of auction is getting really bad. So the year on year number is down 17%. And the largest category, Chinese calligraphy and painting, which was the dominating trade category, is down over 50%. So that's like the bottom since 2011. And we do expect that this trend of contraction will continue because of the trade war, because of what's going on with all the political turmoil and the economic settling. So that's on the trade side, as you mentioned. But I think on the other hand, the excitement is the private museums. We see there's so much happening, which will be taking place in Shanghai next week, where the government in Shanghai branded the week as Shanghai Art Week. You will have a big announcement of the partnership between Youth Museum, LACMA, LA County Museum of Art, and the Qatar Museum. And then Pompidou is opening a Shanghai Center. Team Lab just opened a permanent museum space in Shanghai. And Tate Museum will have a space in Shanghai, in addition to all the other major museums, like Mark Bradford just had a show at Long Museum, and then Yoshitoro Nara show will be traveling from LACMA to Shanghai. So I think what's happening is there is a major structural change with the Chinese art market, where the public auction data will probably continue to shrink in the next year or two, given the economic landscape. On the other hand, we'll see more, first of all, more private museum owners putting on more and more shows of international artists. So just quote unquote, one of the private museum owner told me when she has a show in Shanghai, she wants to guarantee that the majority of the exhibitions are for international artists, and she wants to minimize the number of Chinese artists shows she put on in her museum. That's just a very common mentality. Like, for example, last night, Sarah Lucas had a major show, which I think traveled after New Museum to Beijing. And this is happening across the country. People are so much in love with international artists. They're trying to minimize their, this kind of exposure to Chinese artists, which is very interesting. And in terms of art creation for the artists, where are they going to find their voice? And once they travel outside of the country, can they be perceived as independent art creators without wearing a Chinese label or being perceived as a political artist, which I think will be a very fascinating subject.
I mean, there seems to be huge demand for these exhibitions, and yet the status of private museums seem to be somewhat precarious. Could you tell us a little bit about that, what you see the sustainability of these museums looking like as we think into the future?
So when I did the survey for my report in the spring, and that the major challenges of the private museum owner admitted was how to break even. I think Liu Yiqian was the only person who has been willing to spend over $6 million to support the program and operation, but the rest of people are so desperate to make ends meet in terms of finding corporate sponsorship or find other ways. At the moment, the latest number
Sorry, just to clarify, so for those in the audience who don't know, there's no tax breaks or incentives to,
Exactly.
To found or to operate a museum in China.
Yeah, so the latest number, according to the Ministry of Culture, is in 2018, there are 1,600 private museums in the country. And we don't expect in the next decade, it's hard to predict how many of them will be able to sustain. But at the moment, I think another interesting trend I want to chip in is the unique model for the private museums, especially those in Shanghai, is you have blue chip galleries. For example, like a Mark Bradford show or Bradford show or Louise Bourgeois show at the Long Museum in Shanghai, owned by Liu Yiqian, was pretty much sponsored by House and Worth. Like all the blue chip galleries, they are funding the big international blockbuster shows in Shanghai. So that you don't really see that often here or in Europe. But that has become because the galleries have very strong incentive since going to China to sell art directly as a major tax barrier. So to partner with the private museums, they solve the funding of shipping and exhibition for those museums, and museums can have those very expensive exhibitions happening in the city, and then they really have achieved this kind of a win-win situation for themselves.
Boon, do you see that as particularly unique? Because certainly there have been shows in New York, I won't name names, but that the works are lent by galleries, for instance, largely, and thus there's an implicit idea that the works may be for sale if you're interested in buying them, even though the relationship between the museum and the commercial gallery is not made explicit. Do you think that the situation in China with private museums is distinctly different?
You're going to get me going on. I think there's a lot of hypocrisy going on the part of the Euro-American a kind of scene, One is you must remember legally, I mean, the only actual public, as in like state museum in this country is the Smithsonian Institution, which has an act. I mean, there's an act, there's a budgetary allocation. Everybody else is, to varying degrees, private in the sense, except they behave, they observe all the practices of public museums, that's one. Two is you will see that it's not, I think sometimes China becomes like the punching bag, but you must remember if you look pan across Asia and you see this beginning in India right now with the announcement of, Kiran Nadar has announced David Ajaye as the architect for a new museum, that in developing countries that are now interested in culture and art, there is very little commitment or even capacity, I mean, a lot of time, for sustained public investment in building cultural infrastructure. So it is left to the private and NGO sector to build that. That's just the realities, that's the response, get off your high horse. Who is going to build 1,000 museums in China? I mean, we complain about who? The question, if I was Chinese, not Chinese, I would say, yeah, then who? Is Uncle Sam going to come and write me $1 billion check? No. But this is a kind of genuine response. In India, let's take it out of China, because let's not talk about China. Let's look at other examples. In India, in Delhi, the Kiranada Museum of Art is the only real public museum of modern and contemporary art that has a curator that is paid a salary, that goes to the Venice Biennale, goes to exhibitions to do research, that has an acquisition plan of comprehensively mapping. And they started with the contemporary, then going back to the modern, to the early 20th century. It's the only one. Too bad that it's owned by a tech tycoon, but it behaves like, over time, it behaves like they have education programs, they actually have proper artist talks with the educator and so on. In Indonesia, in Jakarta, the Macan Museum, Pak Haryanto's museum, and by the way, he sits on the board of the Hershon, your only public national museum, so to speak, is the only museum that behaves and is functioning like a public museum that we understand it. That, I think, one is we just need to accept that warts and all, that is one of the few viable ways that museum and cultural infrastructure is built. And I would say we need to encourage particularly those institutions, private institutions or privately initiated institutions. They are not just about the exhibition and presentation of art, but are also investing in education, in creating the scene and the audiences of tomorrow. Usually that's a kind of thing. And one last point is this whole thing about galleries and all that. Have you all ever been to the Venice Biennale? Just look at the number of galleries attached to every single work. That is the reality of a lot of the contemporary art world, because contemporary art is sometimes very expensive and somebody needs to pay for it. It does not mean that there is no curatorial integrity. It does not mean that the art is no good. It does not mean that the artist has sold out. I think, we just sort of sometimes you need to get with the program.
Got it.
I want to follow up on that, Boon, because I was wondering how much things have developed, and this is very relevant to the question of whether China on the mainland does emerge as a kind of a viable alternative, as not just a hub, but as a cultural center for art. So, I wrote about this maybe 12 years ago for Forbes. At that time, even the public art museum, Meishuguan, would basically take placements for payment, as would art magazines, and pretty much the whole market was like this. But this was the government's institution taking money, and that would be why an exhibition by an artist might last 3 days or 7 days. How much has it developed since then, and do you think the government, even if they may be interested in us in the market sense, I'm sure they're very interested in the market sense of developing a new cultural center for art regionally, maybe in Shanghai or maybe in the South. But how committed do you think they are to changing those practices? And has that already changed dramatically in the last decade?
I think it has.
Okay.
I mean, if it was just a kind of dictatorial, authoritarian government, I mean, I would say, why is the Ulan Center allowed to exist?
Right.
I always tell that to my American colleagues. Why is the Ulan Center allowed to exist? It's showing, exhibitions from the '89 avant-garde new wave, the one that
My question was
before.
less about that kind of will on their part, but more about the will to set standards with their own institutions.
I think it's also about learning, right? Because there has been no basis. I mean, it basically is being constructed. But I think in places like China, these standards and these international landmarks are being set by the private sector because they are the ones that are sitting in the boards of the MoMA, whatever, all these is so they learn, I think we also need to accept that the Chinese are intensely good at learning, and we shouldn't sort of think like, this is the standard and it stays there. And your example, I think, says it all. When you look at what Hong Kong is trying to West Kowloon, M+ and all that, I would say Shanghai already has it without, independently. You have the James Turrell show, you have, Olafur Eliasson, whatever, it's all there. And you were talking about this international thing. I think that it's just that because it's coming through the private sector, there are other issues that are in it. So my position is that, at some point in time, just like you say, in the long term, certain things will have to shift. Even if people don't want it to shift, certain things will have to shift. But what we can see as far as the art at the moment is that, yes, there will be, that landing point. You can sort of see there is a landing point already.
Clearly, there's so much to discuss, but we do need to open this up for audience questions. So if you have a question, I think Linda has the microphone.
Yeah, it seems really vast. There's so much to ask. But something that I'm really curious about is what is sort of how does the private market for art work in China? I know that you touched upon how the auction market was contracting, but what is the relationship? Something that I've heard, I've been fascinated by the Chinese art market, but something that I heard was that it didn't have an existing gallery system, and that it's really the auction houses that sort of put art out into the consciousness of the people. So can you speak to the relationship of private galleries in this whole ecosystem, and how does the private art market work?
I think in general, I forgot to mention earlier, those structural changes, we see definitely the auction activities are shrinking, but the private sales, what we mean by private sales is are sold privately, which include between collectors. They trade amongst themselves all the time, and then they buy through galleries. So there are a lot of evidence.
Does that include sales from artists directly to collectors as well?
Exactly. So like that channel as well. And also, I have to say that galleries actually has been very instrumental in terms of nurturing the market, which started decades ago with Gallery Continua, who is an Italian gallery, opened in Beijing back in early 90s, and Redgate. And then you have Leng Ling, who at the moment is the president of Pace. He started his own gallery, Beijing Commune, with Zhang Xiaogang on the roster. And then when Arnie Glimcher decided to expand to China back in 2008, he found Leng Ling and said, the only way I can have any business in the country is to work with you or partner with you. So he had the initial example of Leng Ling became the partner of Pace, at the same time keep his own gallery. So he has about 30, 40 artists on the roster. The younger emerging artists are on Beijing Commune, his own gallery, which is operated next to Pace Beijing, while more expensive artists like Zhang Xiaogang or Wang Guangle or Song Dong are on the roster of Pace. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of collectors do buy through galleries. And other example like Long March, who nurtured artists like Liu Xiaodong and Yu Hong, Lin Tianmiao, and Liu Wei. Liu Wei at the moment has been represented by both Lemon Maoping and White Cube. In Shanghai, we have Shang Art. So Lawrence has been running the gallery for about 23 years, and he has great artists like Ding Yi, who has so many shows worldwide. And I would say that this sector is definitely still there, although we read the news that Pace closed the space in Beijing, but Leng Ling still operates the gallery in Hong Kong, and so he still has his own gallery in 798 Beijing Commune. And I do expect that this sector gonna stay quite resilient, because what we see in the past year is the high end, the middle end of our transaction has shrunk a lot, but the lower end is quite resilient, also increased. So the country still has the second largest high net worth individuals after the United States in the world, above Japan. And those people have so much, extra money to spend. And that's why the major art fairs in the country, like R021 in Shanghai and Westbound, are doing so well, because this kind of spending power is still there. And they buy a lot through galleries.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the very interesting and informative conversations. I have a question about the content of the artworks that are showing in mainland China, because we know that not only the policies, but also they have restrictions on the themes that they're shown in public, such as religion, nudity, violence, drugs, those kind of topics that cannot be touched. And a lot of Chinese artists, they come out of the country and to seek for free expression or something like, or escape, say, from that. So from that point, what do you think mainland China, or say free zone like Shanghai, is gonna replace Hong Kong as an art marketplace? Or is it a must for mainland China to open those kind of topics in order to develop a really true art center in the world? Thank you.
It's perfect for you.
Do you have thoughts?
I'm not an expert on
But you do
censorship.
programs.
But I think, well, censorship exists anywhere. This country has a lot of it. But I think, again, we need to disaggregate what we mean, again, when we talk about an art center, Hong Kong versus whatever. What does that mean? Are you because at a very literal level, it can be, I produce in this country, I show in another country. That's one of the responses that, very, very ingenious Chinese artists have done, And if you speak to a lot of Chinese artists, particularly the earlier generation, they'll say, I must create works that, criticize the government, because that's what I can sell in America. Because that is the image of Chinese art that is anticipated, So I think it's not an easy answer. Of course, sometimes it's very the last Shanghai Biennale, there was, very strange sort of elisions due to censorship restrictions. But I think the same thing happens in India, the same thing is in Singapore, and you just have to deal with it. But I don't think it has, to go back to your question, I don't think it has any direct impact on, if we are assessing at a high level, the value or the potential of this place as a kind of art center, because I think those are much more powerfully affected by other issues, those that we discussed, earlier.
I'm wondering what you think about the issue of censorship in terms of our market center as a center for transaction, because obviously there are places like Dubai as well that have censorship issues. Do you think that this is something that would hold back mainland Chinese cities in terms of being, important art centers from a market standpoint?
I think it's kind of a gray area, because as Boon mentioned, the existence of woolens, and when you think about Sarah Lucas' show, maybe that was a little bit too much for the country 10 years ago, but it just happened in Beijing yesterday. So I think we are talking about a country that has been constantly evolving, and whoever who look at the list of artworks for review might change their mind from time to time. On the other hand, it's an interesting example which just happened, that LACMA, since they signed a partnership with the Youth Museum, the curators of LACMA are sending a group of artworks related to Hollywood subject to Shanghai next week, which is going to open on November the 6th. So the curator worked together with the youth museum. They had to provide a list of artworks from Los Angeles to Shanghai, which had to be reviewed by the local government about 45 days in advance. And some works had to be removed from the list. And the curator at LACMA asked the people who were on the project and say, can we talk to the government and then put the artworks back on the list so they can be shown in Shanghai? And you of course know what the answer is. But nevertheless, LACMA still is having the show. So there's no definite answer to it. But I think we definitely see this as an evolving process. Those museums are, in a sense, are willing to accommodate whatever the scenario is to make sure they have exposure in
And
that
the
part
lack
of the
of
world.
predictability is an interesting aspect to this too, Gadi.
Yeah, and I think that anecdote points to the fact that it's undeniable that political limitations on art would have some effect on the market that develops in a place, about a place's ability to become a cultural and market center. But I would qualify that by saying that, by kind of using that old line about, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. China is where the money is, and it will always be a very important market. And I think the kind of art that runs up against the rules that you talked about, or that crosses lines, is probably a very small percentage of the art that will be the art that will be subject to transactions potentially in a Chinese market hub. And so, for better or worse, I think that that kind of censorship won't significantly damage China's chances of moving, the regional center of art from Hong Kong to the mainland. I could see that happening despite the censorship limitation.
Well, thank you so much. On that note, unfortunately, we're out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up our conversation today. But I want to thank all of our panelists, as well as all of you for attending our discussion. Thank you.
Thanks again to all of you. What a terrific audience. What a great conversation. And I can't tell you how pleased I am to have this turnout. I'm really, I don't know why I'm shocked, but it's just because it's a great topic. It's a great topic, but to see the room filled to capacity like this is wonderful. So come back and see us for something else. Thank you again for coming. Bye-bye.